Human Atlas Initiative. Hope everybody is doing well. Myself, Dr. Anupma Harshal, your moderator for the session today, that is being addressed by Dr. Koel Das, Associate Professor at Indian Institute of Science Education Research, IISER, Kolkata. A brief bio sketch of the speaker today. Dr. Das has completed her MS degree in electrical engineering from Wright State University, Dayton, followed by a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from the University of California, Irvine, after which she went on for a postdoctoral research at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her current research interests include computational neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, with a special focus on visual perception, brain-machine interfaces, pattern recognition, and geometric processing. In her talk today, she will be focusing upon group decision using neural data fusion. Collective decision-making and its benefits have been a topic of active research in the domain of both animal and human behavior. However, research exploring group decision in humans using neural data remains limited to a few studies. Neural correlates of group decision can demonstrate neural benefits in the early sensory stages of our decision-making process. Multi-brain fusion also shows immense potential in terms of applications, specifically in the context of brain-computer interface. In this talk, she will discuss the benefits of group decision making in humans and specifically focus on how neural data from multiple human subjects can enhance perceptual decision making. The talk will also explore on how signal processing and machine learning techniques can be used to successfully fuse data from multiple brains. Before we begin the session, a few announcements for all our participants. If you have any questions during the talk, kindly address them in the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen, and we will take all the questions at the end of the session. The session will be about 40 to 45 minutes addressed by the speaker, followed by a 10 to 15 minute question answer section, which will be handled by us towards the end. So please put in your questions in the Q&A tab for us to take the questions. We will also be taking questions from our YouTube channel, from our YouTube beaming where we are going live. So we will be addressing both the questions. Thank you very much for bearing with me for these instructions. Over to you, Dr. Koel, for your wonderful introduction.
Thank you, Anupama, for the nice introduction. So let us begin today's talk. So I welcome you all to this Manav seminar session. So today we are going to talk about group decision using neural data fusion. As Anupama mentioned, we would be focusing mainly on human subjects. And we would see how group decision affects our individual decisions. How can we benefit from it? How can we combine our brain data by different rules and strategies and then come up with optimal group decisions? Okay, so let us begin our talk. So, as most of us are familiar with the phrase wisdom of the crowds, group decision is quite ubiquitous in our daily life. In fact, there is a very nice book by American journalist James Surowiecki titled The Wisdom of Crowds, which actually covers several case studies that have been taken from various fields of behavioral neuroscience, psychology, behavioral economics, and so on, and they make a fascinating read. Now, this phenomenon of wisdom of crowds is not just unique to us humans. In fact, we know various instances in different species of animals where this kind of group behavior is observed, right from social insects till primates. Okay, so we would look at some of them briefly, but before we start, there is something that we should keep in mind, that typically there are two categories in which our group decision can be categorized. So the decision can be either despotic or democratic. So in despotic decisions, usually there is a group alpha based on its social dominance who takes the decision on behalf of the group. Whereas in a democratic setup, more group members participate in the decisions. Okay, so the democratic setup typically involves some kind of voting mechanism, and usually it is done through quorum sensing or consensus. Okay, so for the remainder of the talk, we would limit our focus to democratic decisions. So it can be actually shown theoretically that the cost attributed to despotic decisions is much more compared to democratic decisions. So democratic decisions anyways is a preferred option. So one of the most studied group behavior is perhaps in honeybees, and there has been some path-breaking research by Carl von Frisch and Martin Launder. So way back, even before the 50s, they came up with this theory of how the honeybees actually find their potential nest locations. Okay, so honeybees, as you know, they have the queen bee, the worker bees, the scout bees. So whenever they're looking for their next potential nest location, so what they do is they have the scout bees which goes out and looks for possible nest locations, and they come back and they report the nest location in form of a dance, a special dance which is known as the Waggle Dance. Okay, so this Waggle Dance is a dance of this figure-8 formation where they waggle a bit here. And this waggle dance actually gives information both about the angle of the nest, where the nest location is and how far it is. So the angle of this waggle actually tells you the direction where the nest location is located, and the duration of this waggle. So the longer they waggle, the further the nest location is. So these two informations are being conveyed by the scout bees to the group in form of this waggle dance. Okay, so the better the locations, better the location is, the number of scout bees rooting for that location increases. So initially you see a few scout bees, voting for that particular location, but as the time progresses, as you can see in this sketch, more and more scout bees, so this is the preferred location, so more and more scout bees actually starts to waggle in this direction, and after a certain number of threshold is reached, after you reach the quorum effectively, then all of the honeybees then move to the next nest location. Now, how this quorum is reached is still debatable, and there's still ongoing research on how exactly the quorum sensing takes place. Okay, so honeybees is one of the most studied in case of animals, especially in social insects, and there has been a lot of research on how the honeybees communicate and come up with a very effective group decision. So we also have other species of animals showing group behavior. For example, just going to briefly talk about a couple. So we have American buffaloes, and their voting behavior is the direction of the gaze. So they look into the direction that they want to move next. And the rule that has been found is that they take sort of an average vote of the adult females when it comes to the taking the decision of where to move next. In case of whopper swans, we have the voting behavior, which is the head movements, and there also there is a certain threshold. Once a certain threshold is crossed in terms of the intensity of the signal, then the group movements takes place. Okay, so now coming to humans, evidence of group decision is omnipresent in our daily lives. So think about jury system, which we don't have here in India, but there are jury system elsewhere where a collection of jury members decide on the fate of an accused, whether he or she would be allowed to go free or they would be found guilty. So a group of medical doctors often form a medical board when they want to treat a patient. And the most common example of group decision is, of course, election. So whereby we vote our leaders by casting vote, we elect our leaders. Okay, so these are all examples of group decision. Now, the systematic study of this phenomenon of wisdom of crowd was perhaps first published research on this phenomenon in humans was probably by Sir Francis Galton way back in 1907, where he published his seminal work titled Vox Populi, which literally means will of the people. So, in this paper, what he did was there was a county fair in Plymouth in west of England where 800 participants actually guessed the weight of an ox. Okay, so there were 800 data that was given to Sir Galton, and he tabulated that, did a very basic statistical analysis on the data that he was given. He had to reject 13 of them because they were ineligible. And then out of the 787 data that he had of participants, he took an average, he used the median, the middlemost value of the guess that all the people made. So the median value of the weight of the ox was 1207 pounds, and the actual weight of the ox was actually 1198 pounds. So as you can see, the average guess was quite close to the actual weight of the ox within a 1% error, and that sort of is the first published evidence that we have of the wisdom of crowd. Okay. Since then, of course, many research papers have come out, and people have worked in various fields, starting from behavioral economics to psychology and cognitive neuroscience, on the evidence and the exploration of group decisions. So one of the early papers in cognitive neuroscience in studying this group decision was by Behrami and others in 2010, where they came up with this effect. They demonstrated this effect that two heads is better than one, which is known as the two heads better than one effect. So in this paper, what they did was they took groups of two participants. Okay, so these groups of two, these are known as dyads. So they took these dyads and they asked them to perform a very simple perceptual task. So what was the task? So they were shown this kind of stimuli, these images, where these are these patches that I'm not sure whether you can see it or not. These are called Gabor patches. And one of these patches out of all the patches shown had high contrast. So the task was to identify the high contrast Gabor patch. So this kind of task is typically known as oddball target. So the Gabor patch having the high contrast is the oddball. So this was the task, and the experiment was such that the groups of two people did this task on their own and then gave their individual decision. Then they discussed freely and then again came up with a group decision. Okay. So what they could show convincingly for the first time is that the decisions made by groups of two is indeed better than individual decisions, even better than the best performer, provided that the visual sensitivity of the members were similar and they were allowed to communicate freely. Okay, so they took 15 such dyads, so total of 30 subjects, and they came up with this result. Okay. Now, in the field of brain-computer interface, or BCI, also this effect of multiple brain data has gained traction in recent years. So in the BCI field, this idea is still sort of in the early phase of research, where hyperscanning, what is hyperscanning? Hyperscanning is a technique which is a framework essentially which allows you to record simultaneously from multiple brains. Okay, So BCI, for those of you not very familiar with it, is essentially a non-muscular pathway through which our brains can interact with the external world, okay, with the environment. So the idea of a collaborative brain-computer interface, or BCI, is very enticing to researchers. So the idea is that you can record data from multiple brains and automatically fuse the data so that you come up with a group decision which hopefully will be better than the individual decision. It not only will be better, but hopefully it will be faster than the group decision. Okay. So this has wide-ranging applications in brain-computer interface in general, although again I should mention this is still in very early phases of research. So my kind of foray into this group decision started when I was working on a postdoctoral project, and there we had a cognitive task where we recorded EEG signals from 20 subjects who were shown images of face and images of car, and then they had to identify whether the image was that of a face or that of car. Okay, so it's a face versus car discrimination task, which sounds pretty simple, but in order to make the task challenging, we added noise to the image, and also the stimuli was displayed for a very short period of time. So the stimuli was only displayed for 40 milliseconds. So once we have collected the data for face versus car for these 20 subjects, what then we did was we fused the data. So we concatenated this data, both their behavioral data and their neural data, their EEG signals, and then tried to come up with multiple ways of combining the data and see which one works better. So what we found out is that the linear combination, which is effectively a weighted average of all the signals, both behavior and neural, and the majority decision, the majority rule, both these rules actually give you good results when you're trying to distinguish between face versus car. Since then, of course, many other papers have been published. There is a recent paper from my old postdoctoral lab, which actually showed that depending on what type of perceptual task you are doing, the linear decision might be optimal, the majority rule might be optimal. So, which combination rule is optimal depends on the type of tasks you are doing. There is this other interesting paper which talks about how we can use social decisions, social informations at decision queues, and then it shows that depending on the level of our individual decision or personal decision, we can combine and use the social information, and this is especially important when you increase the group size. So talking about social decision and social media, nowadays it's almost impossible to escape social media. I know all of you probably don't want to escape social media, but even if you want to, it is almost impossible, especially what the last 1.5 years have shown us. So what we wanted to explore is how much this decision of others affect our own decision making. And this is quite relevant, especially if you think of it that if you want to buy something online, which we have been doing for the past 1.5 years. So the first thing that we do is we look up the online reviews and see whether the item we want has a good review or not. So effectively, what we buy is somehow affected by the social decisions of others. And this is the phenomenon that we wanted to check in a systematic way in a controlled atmosphere of our lab. Okay, so these three are the main questions that we were looking for. So we wanted to see the effect of group decisions on humans, both in behavior data and neural data, and we wanted to see whether it was possible to actually manipulate your own individual decision by showing social cues like decision of others, and what role does your own decision confidence, the confidence with which you make your individual decision, affect your group decision? So these are the basic three questions that we wanted to explore. So I will take you through the experimental paradigm. So this is an EEG experiment. So we conducted this in our lab at IISER Kolkata. So this is again a face versus car discrimination, the way I described before. Okay, so we ask our human subjects to participate in this face versus car discrimination task, but with a difference, which I will come to, and then they gave us their response. Okay, so each trial, we had several such trials, total of 1,000 trials. So each trial starts with a fixation screen. So ideally, you should not move much once you start your experiment for each trial. Each trial duration is about 1 second, so it's not much. So once you begin your trial, you can click anywhere on the screen to begin, and once you begin, you must fixate on the center, and you should ideally not move your eyes. So we have a way of tracking your eye movements. And once the experiment starts, we show a cue, which is your social cue. So what is the cue? The cue is effectively the decision of two people who have already performed this task on this very image. Okay, so FF means two people thought that this image was a face, and then you see the image and then you respond. Okay, so there are four such combinations of cues. So you have FF, where both the observers thought it was a face. You have CC, where both thought it was a car, and then you have FC or CF. Okay, so if you think of it now, then there are actually three types of cues. So one type where the cue and the image actually match. So these we call as concurrent cues. So concurrent cues example include FF followed by face or CC followed by car. Okay, so these are concurrent cues, and then we have conflicting cues where you have FF followed by car or CC followed by F, a face. And the neutral cues are those which are FC or CF, which actually does not give you much information. So these are the three types of cues, and we also have a set of stimuli where you see the same stimuli but you don't have any cues. So this is just space versus card. So that is your individual decision making without any social information. And the way you respond is you just don't say yes or no, whether it's a face or card. What you do is you rate how sure you are that what you saw was a face, or how sure you are what you saw was a card, in a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being you're absolutely sure it's a face, 5 being not so sure it's a face, 6 being not so sure it's a car, 10 being you're absolutely sure it's a card. So that is how you respond. So once the experiment is over, we get two types of data. The first data is the behavioral data, which is in form of the decision ratings, the confidence ratings that you get from the participants, and the neural data is in form of the EEG signals that we get. So we have a 64 channel EEG setup where we use 59 channels for the recording, and the rest are for eye movement and calibration and other things. So we have data from 59 channels spanning over 1 second, almost 1 second, or 700 to 800 milliseconds. And this is our entire EEG data. Now this is a very large dimensional data set, so it's often tricky to handle this kind of neural data. So we employ a lot of machine learning techniques to efficiently extract useful information from the data. Okay, so before we go on to the results, a little bit about our data processing pipeline. So as I mentioned, we have two types of response: behavioral response in forms of ratings and EEG response. So this is typically how EEG data would look like if you go through time. Okay, and this is a person wearing EEG cap. typically looks like that. All right. So once we have the decision confidence ratings from the behavior, and our pattern classifier gives us the neural decision. Okay, so based on this data that we feed into the pattern classifier, we get a neural decision, and from the confidence rating we have the behavioral decision, and then we can see how well these two match or how well they correlate and things like that. So this is our data processing pipeline. Okay, so now let us see the results. So what we did with the behavioral data was that, I'm not going into the details of the paper, but we actually modeled the behavioral data and then came up with density functions for each individuals, and then what we found actually was that the subjects were indeed affected by the social cues. I will take you through the results, and most of the subjects were affected by the social cues in general. The level to which the subjects were manipulated by the social cues varied between subjects to subjects, and we had a way of objectively finding out what is the amount of social bias present in each of the subjects. Okay, so let me take you through the results one by one. So I forgot to mention before, so the decision cues that we showed, although the human subjects thought it was decision of others, but actually truly it was just synthetically generated cues, so that we can have exactly equal number of neutral cues, concurring cues and conflicting cues. Okay, so this first graph, this result tells you this is actually a density distribution of one subject when the actual decision for him or her was the face, but the social cue that was shown was the car. So you can see that these many times he or she was manipulated by this social cue. So 10 being that it's a car, when actually the individual decision was a 3, which was actually face. So in most of the subjects we see this kind of bimodal distribution. So the one mode is that which is dominated by the social cue, the other mode is that which is dominated by the individual decision of the person. Okay, so how big or small these two peaks are would depend on how biased the person is by the social cues. Okay, now for the second graph, so this shows for concurrent cues, when the cues match the stimuli that follows, then what we have is always the decision, the proportion correct taken for the concurrent cues were always more than that of the neutral cues. So this FC, these are the neutral cues. So both in case of face images and car images, always when you have concurrent cues that match the image, your performance goes up, versus when you are shown the neutral cues. Okay. Here in the third graph, what we have is what is we call the crossover percentage. So what is crossover? Crossover is when originally your individual decision is that of a face, but on showing a car cue, you change your decision and give your decision as car. Okay, so when you change your decision, that is what we call the crossover. And what we see here is that irrespective of the original confidence ratings, all the ratings show actually that there are crossovers everywhere. But if you see, there is a trend. So the crossovers are more when initially you are not very sure of what is it that you saw. So this 5 and 6, these two confidence ratings are not so sure it's a face in case of 5, not so sure it's a car in case of 6. So whenever you're not so sure that it's a face or car, then your crossover increases, proportion of crossover increases. Whereas when you are sure about what you saw, without the cues, then the crossover proportion decreases. Okay. Finally, based on our modeling, we can also come up with a social bias score. So what is it? This actually tells us the propensity of a person to be biased by the social cues. And we computed that, and then these are the subjects. So the bigger, the higher the social bias score is, the more you are susceptible to being manipulated by the social cues. So these are all the subjects who were significantly manipulated by the social cues, and these are the few subjects who were not that much manipulated by the cues. So we can sort of rank the subjects based on the social bias scores on their propensity to be biased. Okay. So we call this set of subjects chosen subjects in our neural data. So far I have been talking about the behavioral performance. Now let us move to the neural performance. So here what I am showing you is their performance accuracy, how well they predicted whether it was a face or car when concurring cues were shown, when conflicting cues were shown, and when neutral cues were shown. So the blue bar here represents all subjects, and the brown bar here represents chosen subjects, chosen based on their propensity to be biased from the social bias score that I showed you earlier. Okay, so as we expected, we see that the performance increases for concurring cues, decreases for conflicting cues, and remains somewhere in between for neutral cues. And we also see that people who are biased more as per our model actually are more the effect of the social cues are also more pronounced for these particular subjects, which shows us that the social bias score is actually a good indicator for measuring how biased you would be. All right. The second graph here, here what we did was, because EEG signals have very good temporal resolution, so we can break the signals into 40 millisecond shorter time windows. And that's what we did, because we wanted to see which time after or before the stimulus onset actually plays an important role when these three types of cues were shown. And what we found out was that 200 to 300 millisecond post stimulus onset, after the picture was shown, that is where you see the effect of the three types of cues the most. So it is interesting here because there have been some previous research which shows that when you are shown, target cues, then you tend to sometimes have what is known as an expectation effect. So you expect the object to occur, right? And then you can sort of determine that even before the stimulus occurs. All right. So in order to do that, for example, if you have shown a FFQ, then you might expect a face even before the face is shown. But we found no such evidence of this kind of expectation effect in our experiment. So even irrespective of what the cues were shown, the effect was only prominent 200 milliseconds after the actual image was shown to the subjects. Okay. So we can also see how what parts of our brain were more involved when this type of cues were shown. So as we can see, from 200 to 300 millisecond window, this is where you see the most activity. So the red denotes the electrodes, the locations where you have greater classification accuracy, so greater classification rate. So what we see is, in case of concurring cues, the occipital area, which is in the back of our brain, so it pertains to visual processing mainly. So the occipital area and the frontal area, specifically we found out the medial frontal cortex as one of the areas that are involved in that plays a role when the conflicting versus concurring cues, these two different types of cues were shown to the observers. Okay. So to summarize then, what we find for this particular experiment is that social decision cues can manipulate our own decision making, and the level of manipulation depends on our individual decision confidence to begin with. We did not get any expectation related bias in the early sensory processing. And also what we found out is that 200 to 300 milliseconds post the stimulus onset, we have the effect of cues, which is most prominent in frontal and occipital areas. Okay, so the second and the last experiment that I'm going to talk about here is a bit different. So this is, instead of face card task, we have a target detection task. So what is a target detection task? In a target detection task, you have a target cue that is shown to you, and you have to find that target in the image that follows. Okay, so this is a natural scene that we use. So say the target is guitar, and then you are shown an image which is blowed up here. So here is the guitar. So in this case, it's a target present image, and sorry, and then you respond similar the way you have done in face versus car. So 1 to 5 is target present, 6 to 10 is target absent. So in this experiment, we have 800 images, 400 target present images, 400 target absent images. We had 17 participants doing this study, and we used the same EEG setup where we have 64 channels and we used 59 of them. Okay, now here what we did is, what we wanted to do here is actually to combine the neural data from a different type of experiment, which is a visual search experiment, and see where we get the neural benefit, what drives the group decision and so on. So how is it that we are processing the data here? So say this is the data from one subject over multiple time points. Okay, this forms one set of data. Then we have another set and another set. So say we have a group size of 3. Okay, so this is the minimum group size that we begin with. So we have our individual decisions, which is again group size of 1. Then we combine various subjects in group size of 3, 5, 7 and so on till 17 when we exhaust all the groups. So we keep the group size odd in order to avoid ties. Okay, so with a group size of 3, then for each observer, when we feed the data to our pattern classifier, we get something called the neural decision variable. So based on a variable that the pattern classifier finds after collating the data, after extracting the features, you can think of the pattern classifier like a black box where you actually, based on training data, you come up with a rule and that classifies the data in belonging to whether target absent or target present. So once we have this neural decision variable for each of the group members, then we can combine this data using different rules. So here we use two types of rules: linear combination where we use a weighted average, and the majority rule. So in the next slide, excuse me, I will go over how we combine the two types of aggregation strategies. So once we combine this, now we have neural decisions based on these two rules. Okay, so we can now compare this with our behavioral results. Okay, so let us go and see first how we can combine this data. So let us first go over the weighted average rule. So in weighted average for a particular task I, our decision variable is di, which is nothing but the dot product of w times ri, where ri is your behavioral confidence ratings in case of behavioral data, and neural decision variables in case of EEG data. And your W is your linear weight vector that you estimate from the training data by maximizing the Fisher's criterion function. So once we have that, once we have DI, what we do is for each random group of n participants. So our group size varies. So for each group size, say for group size of 3, we do it many times, right? We do it many times. We form this group. For each time, we have a 10-fold cross validation where we use 10% of the data for testing and 90% for training the pattern classifiers. So we have this kind of 10-fold cross validation, and then we use this to test the performance of the algorithm. The decision criteria C, which maximize the proportion correct, is again estimated from the training data. So the group decision is 1 if your decision variable DI is less than the criterion C, and greater 2 if it is greater than C. So 1 denotes target present, 2 denotes target absent. Now, for the majority rule, for behavioral data, the confidence ranges from 1 to 10. The confidence ratings is 1 to 10. So the decision criteria is pretty simple. It's 5.5. So whoever rated greater than 5.5 is absent, and less than 5.5 is present. Okay. For neural data, it's slightly tricky. So for neural data, the decision criteria for each participant J is so chosen that it actually maximizes the choice probability from the 90% of training data that we have. Now, for each task, we find the number of participants that said target present. So, and the details are there in the paper. I'm not going through it. Effectively, we find out in groups of say 3 how many people voted for target present, okay, and how many voted for target absent. Accordingly, we come up with a group decision. If 50% or more said it's present, then the group decision is present. If 50% or more said it's absent, the group decision is absent. So this is how the majority rule works, both in case of neural data and behavioral data. So once we have that, what we found out was, this is the result, that both behavior majority and weighted average performs pretty well. And what we see is, let me take you through the results. So these are the percent correct. So this is the performance, and this is the increasing group size starting from individual decisions, which is 1. As you can see that as you increase the group size, your performance increases. And of course, the behavioral performance is way better than the neural performance. And this is natural because typically your neural data is quite noisy. So you don't get that much performance to begin with. But even then, you see an increase in the performance. Okay. Now, you might argue that you are seeing an increase in the performance in the neural data because you're using data from more channels. So previously, if you have 30 channels, now you have double the channels. That's why you are getting the information boost. Okay, so it doesn't have to do anything with 2 people's data. It just have to do with more data. So in order to refute that, what we did was, we did this control study where we took data from 30 electrodes, single brain 30 electrodes. Then we took almost double of that. We have a maximum of 59 electrodes, so we can't do more than that. So we took the single brain data of 59 electrodes, which is almost double of this. And then we took data from 2 people, 2 heads, but double the double brain data of 30 electrodes each. Okay, and then we did the classification. And here, as you can see, 59, when you double the data, you get slight increase, but not that much compared to when you actually use the data from different brains. So the performance boost that we get is not just from more data, but from different brains. Okay. So this shows the effectively that group decision indeed is responsible for the boost, not just more data. Now, what I forgot to mention in the experiment is that we also did another additional experiment where we asked a different set of observers to rate how difficult or easy each of the task was. So for each image, we asked them whether it was easy or difficult to find the target or not, because we wanted to check the relation between difficulty level and group decision. Okay, so what we found out initially is that the more difficult the task is, the lower is your individual decision confidence. So this is expected. And then we combined this and then studied separately, dividing the images into this 5 difficulty levels. And what we found out was that that when you increase the difficulty level, so this is the prediction error. So instead of the accuracy, now you have the error. So both for behavioral and neural data, you have the error increases when the difficulty increases, and the error decreases when your group size increases. Okay, so this is not surprising. This is all good. But what is the interesting result that we found was that it is not necessary to use the maximum group in order to get the maximum gain. So here our maximum group size was 17. But what we observed was that we get statistically similar results of information boost if we use a smaller group size. In our case, what we found out was that group size of 13 gives you the same accuracy as group size of 17, also 15, but 13 is the minimum. Okay, so it is not, optimum group size does not necessarily mean maximum group size. So this has an important, sort of application in important observation in terms of application, that the more members you increase in the group, the more cost you start to bear. So if you can achieve the same level of performance with less number of people, then that is of course much more preferable. So this is a way we quantified how much we are benefiting from group decision. And as you can see, it also decreases when you increase the difficulty level. So benefits reduce as you increase the difficulty level, and this is consistent across behavioral and neural data. And this is the ERP. So this is the ERP, means the average of all the neural data that we get per subject. So this is the grand average of all the subjects. So this is the difference wave. So this is target present versus absent. Okay, and what we see is post 250 milliseconds is that most of the difference occurs, and this is also shown in this ERP waveform, where these are the two target present in red, target absent in blue. Okay. Finally, we calculated something called inter-subject correlation, or ISC, group ISC, that measures effectively pairwise correlation between your group members. And what we saw is that as the task, the group ISC sort of peaks around 200 to 240 milliseconds post stimulus ons, and then it decreases. Okay, and as the group size increases, actually your group ISC decreases. So your inter-subject correlation decreases with the group size, and it also decreases. And once the group correlation decreases, then you see the increase in your neural decision accuracy. So we kind of hypothesized that this group inter-subject correlation could be a potential marker for group decision accuracy. So the moment the group correlation decreased, you see the group accuracy increasing. So this is one of the findings from our observations. The other findings are that it is indeed the weighted average rule that gives us the maximum advantage when we are pulling neural information, and that the prediction error increases with task difficulty, and also that the optimum group size need not mean the maximum group size when we are considering the percentage improvement. Okay, so these are the two studies that I wanted to talk about using group decisions. So before I stop, actually just a shout out for our lab. So we have our neuro lab at IISER Kolkata, and we are actively looking for interested PhD students who wants to join our lab, and also postdocs. Currently, we don't have any openings for interns, but PhD students and postdocs are always welcome to apply, and please contact me since I am in the Department of Maths and statistics. So ideally, in order to be admitted in the PhD, you need to have some, maths. Otherwise, you have to take courses. It might get a bit tricky. So anyone from applied math, physics, computer science are more than welcome to apply. For biology students, if you have taken sufficient math courses, you can write to me and I can consider your applications. Okay, so before I stop, I would like to acknowledge my funders, IISER Kolkata, DBT, and DSD, who very graciously gave me, the fellowships and grants that made me possible to do all this research. And last but not the least, my students, especially Tiyasha, who just finished her PhD and is joining a postdoc soon. And Shatuki, my colleague, who is the resident statistician in our group. And also the first work was also done by one of my first students, Bapun Giri, and Arpita Shah Chaudhuri, who's also worked in my lab before. So with that, I would stop here and I would be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Koel. That was a wonderful session with lots of learnings on, hyperscanning, wisdom of crowds, social decision making, neural performance, and very nicely you outlined two experiments, giving us the details and exactly how a researcher would go about saying that we look for car face. So thank you so much for such an elaborate explanation. For all the participants, this is a gentle reminder that the feedback link will be posted in the chat window for both the Zoom session as well as on YouTube. So I'm just addressing a few questions here, Dr. Das, if you can give me
Sure.
a few seconds. Yeah. So we'll begin with the first question, which is a very interesting one. That does the response behavior follow any correlation, to the is it gender specific? Is there any trend that, females or
We
males follow
did
the same social cue? Yeah. Is there any
we did
specific?
not find any such gender specific bias. But then again, we were not really looking for a gender specific bias. But I think to comment on that, we really would need a bit larger pool of sample size to make an effective. So most of our studies, we don't have a big sample size because we are also doing EEG, but we have just behavioral, experiment planned, which would probably do soon, and then we can check whether the experiments, the social bias is gender has a role to play on social bias or not. So far, I think if I remember correctly, we have both male and female participants who shows that they are, malleable to change, and we have both of them in the other category too, that shows that you know they are not influenced by social scores. So
Thank you. What would be your comments? Do you think that the response behavior would follow any correlation with the age? Just in case you have any insights on that.
age is one factor that might give, because ultimately it because we have seen that it has an effect, our own decision confidence has an effect on how, whether I'm going to be a flip flopper or not. So if I am confident with my decision to begin with, then I might not be that much influenced by the social cues. So what we did for that experiment, we also had post experiment questionnaires where we asked whether they were influenced by the cues or not, and almost all of them said yes. And although these cues were all synthetically generated by the computer, they were not really decision cues, but no one suspected that, and then almost everyone said that they were influenced somewhat by the cues. The level of how much they were influenced varied, and it depended on their initial decision confidence to begin with.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. Any specific reference book which you would recommend, or a specific book or content that you would like to recommend for students, to read in this subject? with that
Well,
just discussed?
there's no specific book per se. Normally, so I teach this course with my other colleagues in biology called cognition. So we generally try to follow this principle of neural science by Eric Kindle.
Okay.
Um, but that's like the Bible kind of thing. There's no, and there's also this collected edition of cognitive neuroscience by Michael Gazzaniga. So these are again papers in various related fields. It's a collection of important papers that is edited as a book. So apart from these two books, it's mainly notes and then papers, old papers, important papers.
Okay. Okay. Point
Yeah.
well taken, and I've noted that down. What would be your recommendation for a student who wants to pursue such studies? Which programming language would you think would be good for them to know, would help them to progress in a domain
Okay,
like this? Yeah.
yeah, this is a good question now because typically we do all our programming in MATLAB, but now I think we have also started using Python a little bit. I myself am not very confident with Python, but I'm planning to get, planning to learn it. But mainly MATLAB and Python. MATLAB mainly because a lot of these EEG toolboxes are, MATLAB in MATLAB. So that
Okay.
is one of the reasons that we use MATLAB because most of our EEG toolbox, so EEG Lab, which is one of the widely used public toolbox that we have, is in MATLAB, and then we also do some fMRI processing. So fMRI, so there's this toolbox called SPM.
Okay.
So that is also in MATLAB. So most of the toolboxes are in MATLAB, but
MATLAB.
nowadays there are a lot of applications or toolbox in Python too because it's I think way faster than MATLAB. So I think Python.
At the beginning of your talk, Dr. Das, you mentioned about the jury being present in
Right.
some countries, maybe not in ours. So, can such a decision making by fusion of neural data be used in the judiciary in the future? What are your views on this?
Well, this is like a very heated question. There are a lot of debates on law and neuroscience. So I don't think we are in that stage yet where we can automatically decode the jury's thoughts and decisions
Okay.
right away in order to apply. But I would think that medical decisions, say for example groups of radiologists looking at say mammograms or
Yeah.
something like that,
Yeah.
so that kind of applications seems to be more you know reachable or feasible than the jury system. So I would think like medical applications where you can have a quick decision based on just the EEG data, and then of course you have their original decision so you can later verify. But you just want something quick because we have shown, and it can be others have shown too, that when you decided as a group you come up with a decision much more quickly, especially if you have a larger group size than when you do on your own.
Okay. Maybe there are a few more questions, but one very interesting one. That do you think that the social pressure, which kind of is influencing us to make a decision, could lead to a wrong interpretation?
Yeah, absolutely. Because in the first experiment, where many a times and that's where we talked about this crossover thing. So many a times we are changing our decision based on the social cues. So
Okay.
I think it's a face, but the moment, but then back of my mind, I know that two people have, thought this image was a car. So maybe it was a car,
Okay.
right? So this kind of pressure, again, it again depends on your ability to how sure you are in your own self, sort of own decision. So that would tell you how you know you are going to be influenced, and how can you actually, whatever you are going to say was correct, but
Yeah. You got
because you trusted the social decisions more than yourself,
set.
then you ended up getting the wrong decision.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your patience for taking so many questions and for the valuable insights that you shared. Thanks for sparing your time for having addressed this August gathering today. A few instructions for all the participants. Please do feel free to use the link for the feedback in both the chat window and on the YouTube. Please ensure that you put your correct email ID and that you spell your name correctly, because that's how it's going to be appearing on the certificate. A few more announcements before we close for the day. We have our upcoming webinars, which is going to be on 26th August, where we have Dr. Sarika Jalan from IIT Indore, who will be addressing all of us. And post that, we have 9th September, Dr. Richa Singh from IIT Jodhpur, and 23rd September, Dr. Jhumur Ghosh from the Bose Institute, Calcutta. For those of you who have missed our earlier DSWS series, recordings of all the sessions are available on YouTube, and do follow us on social media handle on Twitter, feedback, LinkedIn and Instagram for getting the registration details of our forthcoming webinars. Thank you to all of you for being patiently having joined us from the Manav Human Atlas team. This is Dr. Anupma Harshal signing off.